Good morning, everyone. It's shortly after 9:30, so I suggest to kick it off. I'd like to welcome you to this workshop on sustainable transport infrastructure in the strategic urban region of the Eurodelta. A purposefully selected long title because this title contains the title of a recently concluded ESPON project. The research findings of which we would like to share with you shortly, very exciting research findings. A project that sought to explain changes in transport sustainability, all the parameters that you are well familiar with, such as CO2 emissions, nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, but also social indicators, through changes in transportation demand, for which the project was also working with a simulation model, projecting transportation demand for 2030 and 2050, and examining a set of policy measures and fields of engagement which are devised to absorb some of the negative effects which will come about as a result of the excess in transportation demand that was simulated for 2030 and 2050. One of which was MaaS, commonly abbreviated, Mobility as a Service, commonly abbreviated as MaaS. And it was a very desired topic across different policy circles. The stakeholders from the Eurodelta, the policymakers which have in fact commissioned to us this research in the first place, were very favorable in relation to embracing the topic of MaaS. However, the topic remains somewhat inaccessible when it comes to its cross-border dimension. We well know that MaaS is advancing at urban and peri-urban scale, but when it comes to its cross-border dimension, it's somewhat inaccessible. It might be even intimidating because of its technological nature, because of the intelligent transportation system routes that MaaS typically will have. But this is certainly not a reason to leave this field of engagement. In fact, we believe, as a territorial research program, that this is just a beginning, and it will gain traction. It will become even more important when we talk about functional urban areas, especially functional cross-border areas. And so in this context, I'd like to make a little link to what Mariana Mazzucato said yesterday. So why I'm saying this, and why do we have this workshop in the first place? I think the goal is that we set the beginning of a discussion on cross-border MaaS, for which we will embrace also the collective wisdom of this group, because it's the first time, I think, that we bring this rather technological topic that is associated with intelligent transportation systems, with data management and so on, to its territorial context. So I think it's the right place to do that. But why I believe it's necessary to set cross-border MaaS in a proper way from the onset. Think of what Mariana Mazzucato said yesterday about market failures and this obsession of combating market failures versus innovation, mission-led innovation. If we think of MaaS as, in a way, an instrument to combat market failure, and if we observe what MaaS actually is currently doing, it is focused mainly in urban areas, in peri-urban areas, and every city, every urban area has its own MaaS solution. So in fact, what we are doing, while we address a market failure at urban and peri-urban level, we are actually displacing it to another spatial unit, to another spatial layer, where we create another set of market frictions. And these market frictions will be even bigger because of the distances, because of different legislation, because of the information asymmetries. And in fact, we will need yet another layer of an entity that will address this market failure. So we will end up with chasing market failure after market failure and end up in a market failure trap, what Mariana Mazzucato was explaining yesterday. Instead, we think that MaaS is not necessarily an instrument to combat market failure, but it's a mission. And as a mission, obviously it requires a great deal of involvement of different segments of stakeholders being on the same side, pulling on the same rope. And I'm very pleased that we have today a representative sample of these segments. We have policymakers with us, we have the researchers, and we have MaaS practitioners. And would like to engage you also in a discussion, because as I mentioned, this is, I think, the first time when we move from MaaS as a technological domain, as an intelligent transportation system domain, to its territorial context. And for that, of course, the ESPON family is very welcome to be engaged in that. I'm pretty sure that this topic will be with us for a while and will gain traction, will grow in importance, especially when we talk about functional urban areas. How this workshop is set up today, we will start with very interesting insights into the MaaS strategy of our host city. We will then continue with the question as to why. Why do we need MaaS in the first place? As I mentioned, we concluded a research that was working with simulations, passenger transport demand for 2030 and 2050, and we would like to present that to you to explain as to why such a cross-border MaaS solution might become very relevant for us in the future. We'd like to also give you the policy side of it. As I mentioned, this project was commissioned to us by a group of policymakers from the Eurodelta, and we would like to give also to provide you with their view. And finally, we will plug in also the two MaaS practitioners today when we address the question as to how we can approach MaaS in its cross-border dimension. Now, without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to our keynote speaker. Audrey Maskelin is head of the Mobility Policies Department in our host city, host metropolitan area, and she will walk us through a very exciting story about the MaaS strategy in Lille, but also its territorial expansion beyond the borders of the metropolitan area, beyond the catchment area of the metropolitan area. So very exciting and very in line with what we would like to debate today. And I look forward to your presentation. Audrey, the floor is yours.
Bonjour à tous. Good morning, everyone. First, I'm going to introduce you to the territory of the Lille metropolis. It's the second agglomeration in terms of density, population density. We have a very dense territory with 1,800 inhabitants per square meters, which is quite a lot. And in the Mel, we have 1.2 million inhabitants. It's the fourth agglomeration of France in terms of size, and it's the first agricultural metropolis of France. We have central cities that are very dense in terms of population, and we also have villages and small cities located in the rural area of the metropolis. And we also have a lot of twin towns, twin cities on the border with Belgium. We are part of an urban area representing different cities of Belgium as well. And we also have mobility issues, of course, in this area. What we call mobility as a service is developing in France thanks to regulations, new regulations and new technology developments. It has changed the typical and traditional solutions that are part of a tradition that we have in France in terms of transport, and we need to use this MaaS strategy to enter a new area to make available and accessible transportation to everyone to go from point A to point B while reducing the environmental footprint of transportation with a specific cost. MaaS will become an indispensable tool for sustainable and smart mobility at the territory scale and level. MaaS has the objective to create synergies while offering services that are accessible to everyone, to citizens, and to people commuting to our territory. So how do we move around the territory today if we want to go from one point to another, point A from point B, we have different solutions. We can take a car, for example. We have to park, we have to pay for the parking lot. We can have also an Ilevia registration. Ilevia is the transport agency of the metropolis. We can also use the subway, take the bus. We can take our bike as well and ride around the metropolis. And we can, for example, park our bike there. Tomorrow, with the MaaS system, we'll have a monthly registration for mobility offering a lot of different modes of transportation. For example, in the morning, I see that there is a lot of traffic, and so my mobility assistant via my smartphone will offer me to take my bike, then to take the subway. I can, for example, park my bike at the subway station. I can save 12 minutes of transportation instead of taking my car. And we can also save 500 grams of CO2, which is good for the planet. Yesterday, for example, I have used a shared transportation solution because my husband needed my car to transport some material, and so I've decided to share a car with someone else. And tomorrow, I will, for example, use a scooter to go back to work. And so this mobility assistant is offering us solutions to find the best journey with the best modes of transportation. In fact, we don't have one MaaS system, we have several systems. And we have a systemic approach. We are talking about a MaaS system with different structures that are interdependent. We have public structures and private structures. And so we have different actions. We can first have access to different systems of mobility with passenger information, route calculations as well, and we also have a ticket system, an innovative technologic system, and so we also have a huge diversity of modes of transportation offered. We have different offers from private operators for free-floating scooters or shared transportation, and we also have public offers that are interoperable from the region. In the metropolitan area of Lille, in fact, we had already used MaaS services without even knowing it, because we used private operators like Google Maps, offering, for example, routes calculation systems, sharing information to the travelers and city dwellers. And at the public level, we have the Pass Central. So we have also a card that we use to move around the metropolitan region. And we also have an operator offering level 2 MaaS systems with the Pass card to use the transportation modes of Lille, to use, for example, the bike garage, to carpool as well, to have access to the recharging stations for electric cars. And so we are already at the third level of MaaS systems, so we are quite ahead of other metropolitan regions in France. We also want to improve the service quality offered to our users. We need to help the users so that they can travel around the metropolitan area more easily, and we need to share as much information as possible to make sure they can move around the metropolitan area as simply as possible. And so users are already highly involved in alternative modes of transportation by using urban public transport. And we also need users to remain loyal to the system, because loyalty is paramount. We need people to have the willingness to switch to sustainable modes of transportation, and to make sure that people are more convinced by those sustainable modes of transportation, and because we also need to comply with our objectives in terms of climate in our mobility plan, which is quite ambitious. We also need to comply with the rules that we have set for ourselves, and we also need to increase the share of cars in our system and to increase the share represented by other alternative modes of transportation, like bikes, for example, and public transport. The MaaS system also paves the way for a new collective system with a partnership with public and private operators that are gathered in the same tool, so that users can have more visibility on all the modes of transportation that are made available to them and that are accessible: collective transportation, bikes, carpooling, self-serve bikes, parking spots available where we have different modes of transportation available, multimodal platforms, and we need to share information on traffic, access to taxis, and we also have free-floating services that are going to be developed. And so we need to share information to the passengers, as I said, and offer them real-time information. This is vital for users because we need to share exhaustive information with them, and we also need to offer them customization options. Thanks to a mobility assistant, the user will have the opportunity to target the right modes of transportation for the journey they want to embark on. And we also need to create a ticketing system for different modes of transportation. It's a new opportunity for us to renew the rates, the fees, and the mobility services that we are offering to our passengers and users. The metropolitan area has been participating in different works that can be considered as the foundations for a new MaaS system. As I said earlier, we were already using the MaaS system without even knowing it. And today we have laid the foundations of this new system, and we are going to create our strategy for MaaS systems. So we have already transportation systems, public systems, that integrate different solutions, mobility solutions, subway, bus, tram, dynamic carpooling, transport on reservation, and we also have a ticketing service available on phones, so you don't have cards anymore. And we also have good connections with interregional trains and buses in the metropolitan area of Lille. And we also have open data systems and data that are made public in real time, so that passengers can have access to real-time information. And private operators can also use our data to feed in their MaaS systems. And we also want to share more data, more information on our context. We really wanted the metropolitan area of Lille to have a real strategy of MaaS. We had the mobility law that was passed, and now private operators can also sell public tickets for public transportation. We also have big projects for infrastructures in the metropolitan area of Lille. SDIT, so it's an acronym that we are using, and we'll have 2 new tram lines and 2 new bus lines that will be developed in the 2 years to come. And we're going to really diversify our offer, but it's not going to be enough to comply with our objectives of intermodality, and it's not going to be efficient enough to reduce our CO2 emissions. And so we also need new public policies, new mobility policies, so that we can reach our objectives for the climate on the territory. We also have the low emission area that should be implemented by 2025 in the MEL. And so in this area, some types of vehicles will be prohibited so that we can reduce our CO2 emissions. We also have strong commitments to develop our infrastructures for bicycle lanes. We also want to increase the number of lanes that we have in the MEL, and we also want to support some policies around bike parking lots so that we can develop the use of bikes in our territory. And by the end of 2023, we are going to also implement a lot of recharging stations in the metropolitan area of Lille. We need to think differently, and we really need to have a strategy relying on MaaS systems. And we have to say that the pandemic has disrupted the attitudes around mobility and the attitudes in the mobility systems. Public transport access was more complex with the pandemic, and we have observed a strong decrease in the use of mobility. And we also have digital tools from the MEL and from our service provider that we need to recalibrate because they are becoming obsolete. So we need to recalibrate the tools to make sure the tools are more dynamic. And so to meet our objectives, the MEL decided to create a strategic framework. We had some deliberations with the elected officials. It was adopted anonymously, and we really wanted to make sure that the works that have already started and the works that we are going to start are consistent. And so thanks to this framework, we'll have a long-term perspective so that mobility and mass mobility remains consistent with the mobility policies of the MEL that are set in the mobility plan. First, we're going to focus on the MEL, so on our territory. And in the end, we'd like also to work on the real mobility basin in which the MEL is integrated while integrating public and private offers. So, of course, we don't want to integrate all of the private sectors of all the regional sectors. We want to go step by step so that we can get the right tools and so that the system is well accessible to our users. So what's the strategy on the short term? So we have different temporalities. First, we want to develop a system that is centered on public systems, public transport systems. By 2023, we'd like to develop a new digital platform to get access to different services. We have a unique mobility account that is going to be implemented as well. With the new modes of transportation, information that are made available to users. Users have a client account for each mode of transportation, so it was quite complicated for users to manage all of those accounts. And so the first solution to tackle this issue is to offer them one single account for all the modes of transportation, so they'll have all their registrations that will be centered and gathered at the same place in the same account. We'll have customization features for routes, schedules as well, and the goal is to have gathered offers by anticipating the selling of tickets, and we also have to use third-party services providers, which is something that we need to abide by the law that was passed on, as I said earlier. We also need to share data with standardized systems, and we also need to apply this MaaS system to the other components of our mobility offer. On the middle and long terms, we need to have a system that is consistent with the mobility basin. We need to focus on longer temporalities, of course, and we also need to anticipate specific works so that they are compatible with the long-term strategy. So we'll have to integrate public and private offers that are highly diversified. We'll have to connect the different systems to different scales, on the territory scale or on private scales as well. We'll also have to expand this system geographically, and we'll have to cooperate with the other authorities that are concerned on the real mobility basin of the metropolis, so that people can also have access to the different systems, people that are using cars, for example, and that are harmful for the environment. So the MaaS will also have to start reflections on life cycle and the availability of data on mobility. So we'll have to start new contracts with the private operators, and we also have to focus on the provisions on shared data, operating data, for example, with predefined standards and norms. We also, for example, share public parking lots information, real-time information for buses. But what we'd like to have or to do is for all operators to exchange and to share data with us. That's why the metropolitan area of Lille responded to calls for tenders. We are now involved in this project since 2022, so that we can integrate standardization in our strategies, and while designing our public transport offer, and in our work with other operators, I'm thinking of operators that will work in the field of recharging stations and operators that are already working on the field with us, or free-floating operators that are going to develop that could be deployed on the territory.
As a conclusion, I'll go back a little bit, if I may. To conclude on the metropolitan MaaS and the MaaS metropolitan strategy, the implementation of a MaaS system really throws some light on making consistent and readable the offer at the level of the users and inhabitant scale. I mean, mobility life area goes beyond the MEL territory and Lille Metropole, and encourages us to develop a MaaS offer beyond extending it to the Belgian territory, integrating a minima, the mining area on the French side, with which the daily interaction is very important. On the long-distance journey, we have mobility using cars on one's own, and looking at the challenge of environment. I mean, those daily trips, long or short or medium distance, emit more and more gas. So this is the occasion for us to offer to those users who don't have the possibility today to have a mobility offer that will be accessible to them and easy to read. Thanks to the MaaS system, they will have solutions, mobility solutions for the day they want, on the day they want, depending on their traveling needs, and that would fit their requirements, the cost that they can bear. And what's important in a MaaS situation is to focus around the user, and it's the user has got to benefit from it, and the user has got to be helped to travel in a different way. And if we can implement this strategy in the long term, I think that we're going to be winning. That's the early days of this adventure, of our strategy. It's obviously huge work that we are starting to be involved in, and maybe in a few years we're going to be presenting to you the results of our MaaS implementation. Thank you for your attention, and I'm available to you for questions if you have any.
Thank you very much for this very inspirational keynote. I think that you gave us already a first hint in relation to what is coming up, in relation to the fact that MaaS in MEL is going to cross the border towards Belgium, and this is actually a signal also to us that we have chosen the right place and the right time to talk about the follow-up of our ESPON research project. There are many interesting points, and I think we are going to circle back to them. We have a dedicated session to which we kindly invite you also to reflect. But maybe two immediate points. First point, you mentioned that MaaS was actually existing without you knowing that it exists. MOVE-IT was one of the examples, and this is, I think, something that happens very often in urban areas. We work on something, but at the same time, something actually exists in the background. We have to make sure that we are actually not creating a clash of those. In fact, what existed in the background, I'm taking as an example MOVE-IT, as it already on the slide. MOVE-IT is actually addressing these market frictions, which we try to address with MaaS with public means. What kind of frictions? Well, what MOVE-IT does is not only to provide information on route planning with transit data, but it integrates also private mobility, such as taxis and Uber. So it actually reduces the frictions already. So it's an interesting topic to discuss. We'll circle back to that again. And the other point is you mentioned about standardization and integration. I think that this is standardization integration when it comes to public and private, and I think this is the point that we wish to make. Not overlapping, but rather integrating. And this is again tying in very well with what Mariana Mazzucato said yesterday in relation to the way how we collaborate, how we pull on the same rope rather than being obsessed with a market failure and chasing market failures, remedying them. Now, I presume that there are many questions, but maybe the first chance to you to reflect on what you just heard, because that was actually the very interesting story. Also for me personally, I wasn't aware that Lille is that advanced in relation to MaaS and actually already thinking in crossing the border. So it's a first signal that we talk already about cross-border MaaS. Any reflections from you? Maybe also some experiences that you may have made in relation to MaaS in your city, in your region? Maybe not at this point. Again, we are going to circle back. We have a reflection round. Maybe you can hear also what the other colleagues will have to say. Now we will turn our attention to the question of why. Why do we need cross-border MaaS in the first place? And here I'd like to plug in also the ESPON research. Let me introduce to you the colleagues from Tractable Engineering, Pierre van den Lemput and Stephanie van den Bogaerde, two researchers who were leading the ESPON research project. Pierre and Stephanie, you have one joint presentation. Can you give us the key findings, the key points when it comes to the simulations and the policy measures? Thank you.
Thank you, President. Yes, we have a presentation here. I will do the first part. Stephanie will do the second part, so she can have the last word on this. My presentation relates to the network analysis and the baseline scenario. So why do we have a baseline scenario? What did we need a baseline scenario? Basically, in order to have a reference in terms of comparison with the policy measures that have been evaluated in the second part of the assignment. So we needed something clear and reliable to have a reference to which the policy measures can be compared and evaluated. So the first step was to find data, and we have used TransTools 3, which is a transport model that has been developed some years ago during the 7th framework program of the European Commission. And it has the advantage of having a global European coverage, so much more than the Eurodelta. Also the advantage of having forecasts for passengers and freight for all modes of transport, except maritime, but it's not a key element here. And also to have those forecasts for 2030 and 2050. So very, very, very long term. So we use this, and I say we use this, it has been developed by other consultants, other group of researchers. So we have used used the data and worked on this so as to have data limited to the Eurodelta area. Then the second step was to identify emission factors, so as to have the environmental aspects of transport, and so we used unit values by vehicle kilometers for every type of vehicle for passengers and freight. Then we multiplied the traffic data, the vehicle kilometers, by these unit emission factors. And the last step is the external trends, which could be added to the first baseline scenario. Stephanie will develop this much more. And so just to give you an overview of how we treated the data, first we had the transport data with a growth in passenger transport and especially road transport. Then the second step was the emission factors. And as you can see here on this example, the emission factors are decreasing over time thanks to technology improvements and to the historical trends. Then if we multiply this, we have the purple curve. So it's still decreasing while traffic increases. The effect of the emission factors, the decreasing emission factors, gives us a decreasing trend. And then external trends, so additional developments in different aspects in the environment mainly, or the policy measures can also have an effect, and the effect would be the curve would be lower than the global trend of the baseline scenario. So that's the purpose, comparing the policy measures to the baseline scenario and see what impacts are most relevant for the different policy measures. So some figures to show you the situation. On the left, you have the model for the whole European Union, and on the right for the Eurodelta area. The growth rates are higher for road transport and also higher for the first year. So it's kind of asymptotic trend for the development of traffic over the long term. In absolute values, we also have on the left the figures for the European Union area, and on the right on the Eurodelta. So you can see the highest curve for the road transport, so many more vehicle kilometers or passenger kilometers by road than by train and air, which is not surprising, but you can see the difference. Here we have one of the maps that we have produced. It shows the traffic by road on the main roads and motorways in the Eurodelta, and the conclusion is that many areas are congested, and there will be many more areas congested. So there is a need to reflect on the policies to be put in place, especially regarding road transport and modal shift from road to other modes that are more sustainable, mainly trains and public transport in the urban areas, but mainly trains on long distance. Just for information, we have also in the model some information about the trip purposes. So it's important to see the differences. For example, here for the internal traffic, it is more commuting, of course, and for traffic between zones of the model, you have a lot more business-related trips. So that was also included in the model. Some figures on the left. You can see the effect of transport emissions. So it's here you have the unit values of the transport emissions. So they are decreasing over time, thanks mainly to the development of different technologies. And on the right, you have the absolute figures, which were used as a reference for comparison of the impacts of the policy measures. Basically, what we observe is that if we consider sustainability and if we look at the results of the forecast for 2030, 2050, globally sustainability is not achievable with the trends that have been considered in the models and the expected trends of the transport over long term, but already in the midterm in 2030. So there is a need for a modal shift using more trains and public transport, and for that some policy measures have been studied and envisaged. Some are already included in the model because the model has considered the policy measures that were known at the time of its development, but still there is more to be done, and give the floor to Stephanie for the next developments and the presentation of the policy measures.
Perfect 10 minutes, and I have 10 left. I push on the button for the next slide. I'm not sure if the green one. Okay. The external trends, as Pierre mentioned, the baseline scenario is based on the slightly older Trends Tools 3 model. It was developed between 2011 and 2016. So the assumptions for the model forecasts have been defined several years before our study, which was performed in 2021. And meanwhile, a series of external trends have been and are still evolving. Brexit, health crisis, I don't need to mention it. And those trends were and are likely to affect the forecasts for 2030-2050. So with our stakeholders in our STISE study, we have selected 6 external trends, as we call them. You can see them on the screen. And we have identified the possible impacts in a qualitative way with the plus and minuses that's also shown on the slide. So the baseline scenario was combined with this set of external trends to add some robustness to those baseline scenario results. And specifically for passenger transport, these trends indicate that a shift from air and road to rail compared to the baseline scenario will be possible when the possible impact of autonomous vehicles, part of the trend technical evolutions in the transport sector, as we called it, is neglected. If, however, autonomous vehicles became available on a larger scale, this might result in a large shift from public transport to car usage, depending on the implementation in the overall transport system. So this is just to briefly explain you what we have done with those external trends. Here we go. So the main line of reasoning is that we need additional policy measures. Transport will keep on growing autonomously. Trends make good progress, but they don't bring sustainability development goals within reach. So we need bold policy choices. So now we go to the policy analysis, the second part of our study. The potential impact of 4 cross-border policy measures with a focus on cleaner and faster mobility in the Eurodelta was assessed. Those 4 policy measures are also shown on the screen: aviation shift, zero emission zones, potential of MaaS, and improving regional cross-border public train transport. In the Eurodelta, those are the 4 measures that we assessed. A 3-step approach was used to come up with those 4 measures. We started with a long list, based on the input that we received from our stakeholders. We went to a short list, we performed some kind of quick scan, and those are this is the selection that we made. I will now quickly guide you through those measures, just to give you a bit an overall view of what we have studied in our research. The aviation shift, this means that we've done some research on a policy ban of all regular aviation services on short and mid-range distances within, to and from the Eurodelta region, with a shift obviously to high-speed rail. In terms of impacts, this measure could have a non-neglectable impact on the CO2 and noise reduction in and around the concerned airports in the Eurodelta. A reduction of about 1 million ton of CO2 could be achieved, contributing to more or less 0.1% to the overall ambitions of the European Green Deal, which is fairly high for a geographical area that is quite small. It covers hardly 1% of the European territory. We could say a lot more about the impacts, but I will just stick to the main messages here. We have also made some policy roadmaps for each of those measures. It will take a lot of time to go to explain them in detail, and it's also explained in the report. But for this specific measure, it's obvious that it needs to be discussed at European level in order to bring about the necessary regulatory legal changes. And we would also advise to appoint some kind of ambassador with an appropriate support team that could coordinate such a policy measure. Then I go to the next measure, the second one, the zero emission zones. We need more and harmonized zero emission zones in all major cities in the Eurodelta for passenger cars, light duty vehicles and heavy duty vehicles. In terms of impact, our conclusion is that by implementing this measure, we could contribute with about 3% to the overall CO2 ambitions of the European Green Deal in 2030. The environmental impact of this measure could be considerable, again, taking into account the relatively small geographical scope of this particular policy measure. Harmonizing zero emission zones could also have substantial efficiency and societal benefits, but it's a bit sensitive, of course, as specific population groups and economic actors could be adversely impacted if not targeted by accompanying measures and implemented that need to be implemented. So this is also something we paid attention to in our study. For the roadmap, the most important message here is that an appropriate forum for policy dialogue should be set up to assess the political feasibility, the options for harmonization, and their impact. Then the third measure or ambition that we dived into is the potential of MaaS in the Eurodelta, with a focus on passenger transport. We assessed it from the public authorities' perspective, defining the role of public authorities having this development, what kind of role do they have, how can they operate, and what is the potential benefit they can realize if this measure is effective, considering the required accompanying measures in order to realize this benefit. When we take a look at the roadmap, a first step is for policy measures to set up an organization to coordinate the unlocking and the governance of MaaS relevant data. And then I jump to the last measure, the improving of regional cross-border public train transport. This policy focuses on the improvement of the specific regional cross-border public transport in the three main project corridors we initially identified there, Rhine-Waal, Rhine-Scheldt, and Lille-Brussels, resulting in a shift from road to rail transport on those cross-border sections. The assessment showed that a shift from road to rail could be realized for several cross-border corridors in the Eurodelta. There is sufficient demand to operate profitable rail services if, of course, the cross-border connections are well integrated within the national rail and bus services, and if passenger-friendly services are provided. It's a smaller measure, but nevertheless it's important for those specific cross-border sections. For the policy roadmap, the challenge here, the main challenge here is optimizing those cross-border cooperations, as rail transport and infrastructure are currently organized by national or regional bodies and controlled by national authorities. And a first step could be for regional and local stakeholders to learn from existing successful projects. And then a last slide, I realized that I showed I've hidden the wrong slide. I wanted to show the numbers, but okay, I think it's still readable. But this is, it's not a table to compare, it's more a summary to show you the estimated impacts of all those measures from a quantitative and qualitative point of view that came out of our research. And the study shows that in the context in which those four policy measures have been studied, that they could all lead to a non-negligible improvement in the sustainability within the Eurodelta. And maybe as a final thought or conclusion from our side, that initiating the STISE study puts the Eurodelta in the spotlight somehow as a progressive mega region that wants to really step forward as an innovative pioneer area in Europe. And the Eurodelta could be an interesting and promising pilot area to try to implement those ambitious policies of parts of those and those concepts. And it could demonstrate the sustainability gains that can be made in a smaller area and could serve as an inspiration for other regions in Europe. And my 10 minutes are up, and this is what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Stephanie and Pierre. Well deserved. Well done research. Just one reflection. You may have still the mental picture of this diagram with the decreasing CO2 emissions from passenger transport at an increasing rate, right? So it's going down at an increasing rate. You may say, well, perfect. That's all good. So in fact, we will end up at some point in future having zero marginal social cost from passenger transport. That's great. But at the same time, we have an increasing demand at an increasing rate, right? So it's going exponential. And this is why there is a need for additional measures, as you use also properly the word radical measures. This is why we actually had to investigate additional measures. That was also the mission from the group of policymakers which are behind this research. So the thank you comes actually, we are just a conduit from ESPON. The thank you comes actually from a group of policymakers from the Eurodelta. We have the representatives here, and the driving force behind this project, Frank Beckers. Frank, maybe you can walk us a little bit through what was the thinking behind this project from policymaking perspective, and who are your fellow policymakers behind that?
Yes. Good morning. I'm Frank Beckers, contact person of the lead stakeholder of the STISE analysis, which is province of South Holland. This is a metropolitan region in the Netherlands of 3.5 million inhabitants, includes cities like Rotterdam and The Hague. And in this picture is at the red cross in the middle of the circle. The research was committed at the initiative of 10 project stakeholders of 4 countries in the Eurodelta. This is the Eurodelta is the yellow area, and the stakeholders are the orange area in this picture. These stakeholders represent the most urbanized areas in the Eurodelta. We were happy that a metropolitan of Lille participated actively, and other stakeholders were region of Flanders and region of Brussels from Belgium, the regions of Ruhrgebiet and Rhineland of Western Germany, and from the Netherlands also Amsterdam, The Hague and province of Gelderland. The questions in the terms of reference contain 4 issues to be analyzed, and as you saw, they were analyzed. Namely, 1, just to know flows of persons and goods. 2, what's the policy gap between sustainability targets on the one hand and a business as usual scenario on the other hand. 3rd, what could or should be additional policy measures to bridge this gap. And 4, the role of cross-border inter-metropolitan cooperation in these measures. How did the policy analysis and the role of mobility as a service develop as seen from stakeholders' perspective? Well, as Stephanie told, the research consortium offered to analyze 3 or 4 policy measures in depth. The selection was made by an interactive quick scan. We made a long list of 33 possible additional measures, and these were assessed by several criteria, which were phase. We preferred measures under development, estimated public support, societal and environmental impact, spatial and urban planning aspect. the group who organized this were mainly spatial planners, and of course ESPON is a spatial planning observatory network. That's also important. And the balance of the package as a whole, which means measures about transport of goods, also of persons, of different level, a mixture of phasing out and phasing in measures, cross-border aspect about connections, but also about getting critical mass or alignment. And this resulted in the choice which Stephanie has been told about. The 4 measures, air to rail, road to rail, zero emission, and mobility as a service. And mobility as a service was chosen, of course, because it fitted well into this criteria. And well, in a few words, it helps providing seamless, clean, comfortable, and efficient alternatives for planes and private cars. Of course, there were initial doubts. Someone said, well, MaaS is mainly about an app. What's the actual policy measure then we should analyze? Are there any cross-border aspects? How to assess impact anyway? But anyway, working this way, the whole policy analysis had an output which for us stakeholders was above expectation. In my words, the 10 project stakeholders now can present key players like also national governments, other cities, European Union. We can present a balanced package which requires relatively few new infrastructure. That means not much new, not any new AHL line, for example. And it can bridge the policy gap for quite a lot if cross-border multi-level cooperation starts now. So, well, one question I got was, is MaaS still in the corner of the package? Well, it's more a kind of new kid on the block. Compared to the other measures, it's relatively unknown. It's, of course, less visible than rail improvement. It has got less impact, CO2 impact, than zero emission zone, which is huge. But the conclusion of the outreach meeting so far are, well, anyhow, we need the whole package. Thank you. This was the stakeholders' view.
Thank you very much, Frank. I'd like to turn now to the next stage. We have 2 MaaS practitioners with us. And in fact, you mentioned correctly, Frank, we've been asking ourselves, is MaaS actually effective? Or how to measure it? Is it more effective than zero emission zones? We simply assumed it is, but maybe it's not. So now we have a MaaS practitioners with us actually to walk us through what that means and what's the cross-border aspect. I mean, with MaaS, we had to face something that we refer to in ESPON as spatial blindness. We didn't know how to organize at the cross borders because of the lack of standardization. And as I mentioned before, the moment when we actually create MaaS solutions at urban and peri-urban scale, we create additional frictions on the market at the higher level, higher frictions because of growing distance, growing efforts to plan and different legislation frameworks. But now we have the MaaS practitioners with us. And I'm very happy to introduce Tjale Groen from a Brussels-based Impact. Tjale, you may actually remain seated if you like. I'll give you right one over there. As you wish. Tjale is one of the famous faces of shared mobility in Europe. So I think it's a privilege for us in ESPON to host him here. Typically, he will be present at shared mobility events, and he's very well known in the industry. And Tjale, you represent Impact. Impact is dealing with shared mobility in the first place, but has certain aspects of MaaS. Can you tell us something about the service model of Impact?
Yes, I will try to do that. To start with a link to shared mobility, last week in Bremen in Germany, we organized a conference to talk about why shared mobility rocks. There were over 200 participants from all over Europe, and I even have the socks to prove it because we made shared mobility socks. Nice wordplay. And this is a great example of what we want to do with Impact. We want to create an impact on mobility. And as a non-profit based in Belgium, I am based in Ghent, not in Brussels, but that's different country, it's almost the same. We always try to stay close to the motto, do more with less. And that means sharing, and that is something that rocks. The beginning of this year, I became project director for Impact, but before I've been involved in MaaS and data sharing and standardization for a long time, even before it even was called mobility as a service. Back then, it was just a river flowing to my birth area in the south of the Netherlands, the MaaS, so it's a different thing. With Impact, we will go to the big green button. We work around 3 pillars. We have solutions, innovation, and awareness. I'll look at that screen. Solutions, I will come to the last, in the end. First, awareness. That's something we do by doing these talks. It's also something we do by organizing Shared Mobility Rocks. And when we talk to governments, to policymakers, to all possible players in the mobility field to actually achieve our goal towards more shared mobility. Innovation speaks for itself. I will come back to that. And for solutions, I have 3 examples for you. First off, we do different things. I just picked 3 random that fit with this. The first off, we have Cozy Wheels. It's a car sharing operation, but not with a fleet. It's a peer-to-peer system where we enable people to share their car or their cargo bike with their neighbors, so in a very small scale. Next to that, we run a service called MobiTwin, where we work together with communities all over Flanders and Belgium to actually bring elderly people to their doctor or to their hairdresser's appointment by working with volunteers. So that's something that we do. And then the last thing I wanted to point out today is carpooling, especially the commuting version of carpooling. And that is also what comes to MaaS. I have just a picture of some MaaS things. What I think is important in MaaS, it's connections and it's cooperation. I'm just going to leave this image as an aspiration while I talk further. Fazilin, you asked me to talk about our integration of carpooling in Olympus Mobility. So Olympus Mobility is a MaaS application in Belgium that focuses on the commute. So homework and back to that, which is actually quite good for carpooling because carpooling works best if you have a defined set of rules where you have the same route you take every day at the same time. So this fits really well. What we did is by collaborating with Olympus, we integrated a full carpooling journey into that. So as a user, you can now sign in for this. Your home address and your work address will automatically be used to create a ride that is put in the system, and that will automatically be referred to people who are searching for a ride. It will be suggested to them, and they can enter a ride with you, and even the whole payment can be handled within that MaaS application. This is particularly interesting because it's focused on Flanders, but it also works. Carpooling is something that works over the border as well. It doesn't matter where you go. You can go to Lille from Courtrai, which we were talking about earlier, where I also lived for a while, so I know this area a little bit. So that is something that we made to that, but it's important to note that when doing that, it was a lot of work to achieve this, because you don't have a standardized way to do it, especially when we did it, and we wanted to do it, and we trusted each other, and we cooperated really well, and that's why we were able to achieve it. But in the long term, it's not feasible to do this with all parties. We cannot do this with other MaaS parties because it just isn't worth the time and effort. That is where something else comes in, and that is the main thing I want to talk about, and I have been talking about a lot the past years. That's standardization and data. Since 2019, I was involved in the TOMP working group, creating something called the TOMP API, which focuses on a lot of things I saw coming here on standardizing the data and making it work. We're also in talk with FATMOP, as well as they're super interesting people, and I've had really nice chats with them to make this work as well. And that is where cross-border becomes interesting, because you inherently, you see Flanders making MaaS, you see Brussels making MaaS, you see Lille making MaaS. You put the effort of cross-border in there, but not all do. In Germany, for example, Berlin has its own MaaS scheme. Hamburg has its own MaaS scheme. Every area, Rhineland, Ruhrgebiet has its own MaaS. Everybody's creating their own thing and nothing is connected. And that is what I would advocate for, to connect these things. Instead of creating little MaaS islands, connect all these islands. And even the TOMP API, I won't go into detail about it, you can find a lot of that online, enables different MaaS organizations and players to work together as well, and to not only exchange data between the transit operator and the MaaS provider, but also between the MaaS providers themselves, and thus so really realizing cross-border MaaS in this area. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Tjelle. This is exactly the point that I wanted to make. Very, very well done. Talking about connection, we have another MaaS practitioner with us who might be actually serving for these connections of between different MaaS systems. Lorcan Le Pen, his general manager of Transer France, working with data, including long-haul data, long-distance data, correct? Providing content across different MaaS islands, so to say. Obviously, we still rely on the incumbents to connect the different urban areas. But we need also content providers, we need also booking systems. So there is a whole range of additional services that we need in order to make what Tjelle is advocating for, in order to make it happen. But it's actually going to happen. So, Lorcan, please tell us something about the business model of Transer and about the way how you engage in cross-border MaaS.
Yeah, sure. So moving on to the next slide. So I will present for a few minutes Transer. What is Transer about? So our mission, so we are a scale-up first, so we are a small team, a small company, initially based in the Netherlands. We are a Dutch scale-up, now active in more countries. And our mission is really to, is hassle-free mobility across Europe, and Western Europe especially. And how we do that is really that Transer is try to simplify the access to public transport and other mobility by offering a planning, booking, and payments centrally on a smartphone. So we are taking care of all the commercial and technical complexity that comes with providing mobility ticketing. It is really tough, and we are integrating in any app and platform via one application programming interface, so an API. So enabling end users, travelers, to plan, book, and pay for their journey. So this is really the objective of Transer. So the plan, book, and pay. So we are solving key points for end users. So of course, as you know, having different apps, different public transport systems is really complex for the user, and especially for the commuters, for not the commuters, the occasional users, which who don't know really how it works, the network and everything. And so you have separated apps, long queues when you arrive. I just arrived this morning in Lille from Paris, and it was okay, but sometimes you can see long queues. And so complex timetables. So definitely a lot of concern for the traveler. And what we are doing by combining, aggregating all the complexity of public transport and other mobility is we bring, we try to solve these pain points, really bringing this capability of MaaS into end-user platforms. Here you can see an example, but we have many more. So we are focusing on European territory. So as I said, we are a Dutch company initially. So based in Amersfoort, near Utrecht. But we have now also 4 different offices in France, Germany, and Italy. And we are covering now nearly 85% of the public transport network in the Netherlands. A lot in Germany. We have few lenders already, and a Verkehrsbunde into our API. In Italy too, in Switzerland, and France it's just starting now. We've opened the office last autumn, in October last year. And so we already have a lot of combination of transport mobilities. So with trains, so we are covering most of the train carriers in Europe with SNCF in France, SNCB in Belgium, NS in the Netherlands, Deutsche Bahn and the CFF, for example. And we propose all of them on our platform. So also long distance trains, but also regional trains. So we have the ability to have the full offer from these carriers. But we have other type of mobilities too. So we have public transport, urban public transport. So we are connecting to a lot of different operators, and we have so Keolis, Transdev, for example, and others like this. So we are dealing with authorities, of course, in these metropolitan or urban areas, also with the operators. And now we have more than 170 operators connected. We have long distance buses also. We have car sharing. We have micro mobility. So 8 different types of mobilities accessible from our API. And our targeted countries are let's say 20 countries in the Western Europe. So how we are doing that? Just simply, so we are aggregating all the content. So we have the contract with the operators, and so let's say Deutsche Bahn, SNCB, NS, and all the others, which are at the bottom here. And then we integrate them into a single API, where you can actually book and pay and display your tickets. Or you can get your tickets. And then we provide this API to third parties, like MaaS providers. It could be Glimble, for example, Movit 9292, which is quite famous, I think, in the Dutch area. Not really in France, but in the Dutch area. But also working with others, like Vim, Skipper, or others. So we have a full... We have a lot of different integration possible, and so we can also work with airlines to combine a flight plus a public transport or rail offer in combination, which is not existing or really not really existing right now. So we are active definitely on MaaS. So we are aggregating all these, this is just a few examples, but all these different mobilities into one API and displaying it in third-party apps. So MaaS is not just an app, of course. It's more than that. It's about connections and coordination between operators, authorities, and MaaS integrators or MaaS players. And finally, we are also delivering CO2 footprint display for every journey booked through our API, and we can display that for every trip. So the end user really knows how it works and see really transparently what is the best and the most suitable transport mode. And I think it's definitely important for the user, the end user, to know exactly what he will spend in terms of CO2. So I think that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Lorcan. One immediate question to you, as your business is actually based on data. You work with open data, including open data from public transport, from the incumbent operators. Now having also policymakers which to a certain extent are behind data availability. What is your experience with data availability and with the data quality? And what would be your message to policymakers, including also the policymakers dealing with territorial policies, where we have yet another layer of open data that might be interesting for MaaS as a paradigm?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yes, of course, it really depends on the territory or the country we are talking about. So we are, as Transer, we are active in 6 different countries. We are active in more than 6, but really active with multimodal offer in 6 countries. In some of them, the public authorities in charge of the mobility, in fact, are more open than in others to participate in a public-private initiative. So, of course, it's not taking into account all the complexity of the technical complexity of ticketing, because there are a lot of complexity here. But it's more the relationship between a public body and a private one, like a startup. And there is always a fear of losing the data at the end for some of them. So in general, when we speak about data, passenger information and journey planning data are really good everywhere, I would say. At least on the Eurodelta region, it's definitely really good. The missing point for us is mostly on the ticketing side. We are lacking access to APIs to get access to the ticketing. So this is I would say one of the and some it's one of the main complexity for us. It's about ticketing. So right now we can do it in most of the Eurodelta region, in most of the cities. Let's say in the Netherlands, not yet really in Belgium. We haven't got a deal with Brussels and Wallonia, but it's because they have their own MaaS strategy. But we have deals in place also in Western Germany. So we have the ability to resell a public transport ticket, for example, in Düsseldorf. So they are really open this way. So I would say that some parts or some territories are more moving forward quicker than others. And I think if you want to have a territory like Eurodelta strategy, others, big urbans and metropolitan areas needs to be also in the same progress. Let's say. Yeah.
Many thanks, Lorcan. Let's stay with this thought for a while, that some territories are moving quicker than others, and the missing APIs when it comes to booking. But let's use that moment and give the floor to our audience. If you have any reflections, any questions, again, I think it's a very unprecedented for us in ESPON to host also MaaS practitioners with us. We've seen very interesting solutions. Is there any immediate reaction from the audience?
Just 2 quick questions. First, coming to Stephanie and Frank. The policy roadmaps. What would you say? Is this the ambition, or is it already stakeholder commitment to sign, say, the Eurodelta Mobility Manifesto and work on those policy roadmaps? And second question, as a potential user of MaaS services, a question for Toshale and Lorcan. As a potential user, do I have to become a loyalty customer of one of your solutions in order to be able to, order a service? Or am I free to choose just by, determining A to B? And then I have a palette of different MaaS options to choose from. How you will navigate the user, the potential user? Thank you.
I think it goes beyond ambition.
but I think Frank is better positioned to answer what is going on at this moment with the results of the study.
Yes, I will. Yes, what we're organizing, outreach meetings like this one. We are halfway now, so we have had meetings in Belgium, this in France, this month also in the Netherlands and Germany, and in October in Brussels, in the Week of the Regions, an international meeting. In those meetings, and of course between those meetings, we try as stakeholders, because as stakeholders we're not the we're not the key players. Well, we are key players, but there are key players like national governments, European Commission, and we try to interest them, of course, first to disseminate this this report and study, and then we try to interest them to taking a leading role, because all these roadmaps start with there should be some kind of ambassador or some kind of network chair. And well, we think that there are possibilities. For example, I know Benelux Union is already playing on mobility as a service on cross-border level, on Eurodelta level. So we hope to get in the end of this year that key players will take their positions.
Thank you for your question as well. Just a quick view on our perspective from it. I was talking about the TOMB API, and the TOMB API is actually an open source way to communicate trip planning, trip booking, payment, everything that is involved in that. So from that perspective, for us, it's super important that the user gets to choose. And that you can only achieve by, I think, things like your company really have a place because it professionalizes everything and it makes things easier for others. But it's good that there is an alternative solution, which is very valid and completely standardized as well, where anybody can do it in their own way. So you create a sort of more or less level playing field for different MaaS parties to actually enroll their services. And in the end, I would really like to see that a user can choose what he wants. If you're living in Berlin, you have the Yelby app, and you can use the Yelby application as well here in the metropolitan area of Lille. That would be amazing. Reality-wise, we'll have to see what happens, because there are a lot of interests going on to prevent this. But I think that is something that, for a user experience, would be the goal to work towards. You haven't.
No, I just want to say that exactly we have exactly the same position. So yeah, totally same position.
I have a question about the transfer. What's your business model, and ultimately, how do you earn money?
So initially we are a commission-based company. So we receive commissions from the different operators that we connect on every transaction made through our API. But as we are also connecting to end-user platforms are also paying a fee. So that there is a percentage that they have to pay for us for processing bookings and payment through our API. So that's the model.
Do you think it's if there would be no one company like yours, but 100 in Europe, what does it mean for the transportation system? Is it improving transportation or not? Is it is it generating more transportation needs or not?
I think, yeah, I think that's the objective of MaaS, of course. We are, in fact, we are enabling others. So that's really our ambition. So we are enabling other end user platforms that already have their own user base, large audience, yeah. And so we think that, and we will not focus really on commuters, but more on occasional users and touristic users. So that's also, I think, that where we can bring more people in the trains. The modal shift will come if they can book easily, I don't know, a train plus a public transport from when you're traveling from Lille to Utrecht, or I don't know. It's really easy. And I'm just after this meeting, I will go to Amersfoort in the Netherlands from here, and I've booked everything on the Transit app, because we also have an app that and in one go. And it's, I think that I like to travel by train, of course, but it's a complexity if you want to travel and booking in different. And right now, that's the only possibility. You need to buy on different and to book on different apps. So that's the main challenge. So we can bring more people on the trains and on the public transport networks. Yeah, I think.
Thank you very much, Lorcan. Are there any other questions? At this stage, we have actually reached the end of the workshop, but allow me one more minute to lead everything together from the moment when we started. So the next slide, please. I'd like to circle back, as I promised, to what Audrey presented in relation to Mel. It was the next slide. Yes, exactly this one. And with particular attention now for you, Lorcan and Tjale, because Tjale, you also mentioned that some interests are actually preventing from cross-border MaaS to happen. So what Audrey describes here is very interesting, because you see that there is a natural correlation between the spatial expansion, when we talk about cross-border MaaS, and the level of integration towards private micromobility. Nevertheless, we don't see a straight line. We see different scenarios. It's very interesting to observe that there are different scenarios. One of which is actually we first need to go all the way up. That's the first scenario, to the private mobility, and only then expand. Second one is halfway. So first expand to capture the catchment area of the metropolitan area, and only then expand to integrate also private micromobility. But look at the third one. And the third one is actually assuming the role of MaaS enterprises, because in fact it is actually attempting, and here we go back to what Mariana Mazzucato said, we are chasing after market failures, after market failures, after market failures. We try to do the job because we think it's not fast enough. We try to do it without the private operators, but it is exactly the private operators that are addressing the frictions on the market. Now, is that a realistic scenario, the third one? And here the question, Tjale and Lorcan, to you, where do you think is public intervention best positioned in relation to MaaS, in order to make MaaS, and in particular cross-border MaaS, to happen, to be a reality? And then I'd like to give a final word to Audrey to reflect on the answers from Tjale and Lorcan. Very briefly, Tjale and Lorcan, with just one sentence, what do you think is needed? What is your message to the policymakers? One sentence.
To support local operators to adhere to the standards that are available, and to support them in achieving that goal. That will help a lot.
Yeah, in short, I would say that yes, from our side, it's mostly good cooperation with private MaaS solutions. Good cooperation means also opening the discussion for also the ticketing side. So yeah, definitely.
What you say is that the public should be actually supporting also the opening of data standardization, data quality, and everything that is missing. Audrey, the final word to you. We started with you and we would like to end with you as well. What will be your reflection on the future of cross-border MaaS in relation to what you also heard now from the practitioners?
Several MaaS will cohabit. I mean, the MEL has a strategy of MaaS at the scale of the living area in the MEL. Several MaaSes will coexist, regional ones, national ones, European ones, and these MaaSes will cohabit. And it's interesting for the users to have access to the different MaaSes. And that's what we're going to do at the Eurodelta region, to give the possibility for the end user to have access to all these MaaSes. So we need to standardize data for these data to be accessible to all users. The public will be able to have access to this, some private data, and all the standardized data will make sure that the end user has access to mobility solutions which will be suitable and will also contribute to the environmental challenges we have to face with the diminution of GHG, and we have to reach standardization of data to be able to enable that.
Thank you very much. And I think that this ties in very well with the final message and final announcement I wanted to make. What Audrey just described is very much in line with what we are doing currently for the next ESPON seminar, when we talk about entrepreneurial regional governance, when we talk about open data, and how how public authorities are actually helping enterprises rather than assuming their role in chasing after market failure. So, well, on that cheerful note, I'd like to thank all of you, also our guests, and I kindly invite you, well, first of all, to enjoy the remainder of the ESPON week under the French presidency, and also already consider your attendance under the Czech presidency when we are going to talk about entrepreneurial regional governance. Thank you very much.